It was supposed to be the perfect summer getaway. A secluded campground nestled deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. Just the rustling of the trees, the crackling of the campfire, and the laughter of a few friends. Nothing could go wrong. But for Jason, Emma, and their two friends, Dan and Sophie, that weekend would become a living nightmare they would never escape. It all began as they drove deeper into the forest. The roads narrowed, the trees grew denser, and the sunlight barely touched the ground. The forest seemed to swallow them whole. Jason had heard the rumors, of course. Every campground had its dark side. Some spoke of strange noises in the middle of the night. Others whispered about campers who had vanished over the years. But none of it seemed to matter. They were here to escape the world for a while, to disconnect, to enjoy a few days of quiet. They arrived at the campground in the late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The campsite was almost empty. In fact, the only other sign of life was a solitary camper in the far corner of the grounds. It was an older man, sitting by his own campfire, the flame dancing eerily in the fading light. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," Emma remarked, stepping out of the car and stretching her arms. They began unpacking, setting up their tents, and collecting firewood. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the campground was wrapped in a blanket of shadow. The fire crackled brightly, sending sparks into the night sky. They roasted marshmallows, shared stories, and laughed under the vast canopy of stars. But as the hours passed, a sense of unease began to creep into the air. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, but Jason noticed it. He couldn't put his finger on it. It was as if the woods themselves were watching them. A quiet presence, waiting. Dan, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as nothing more than the wind. "We're in the middle of nowhere," he said, taking a swig from his beer. "Just the sound of nature." But as the fire flickered and the others continued chatting, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His eyes kept drifting toward the darkened corners of the campground, where the shadows seemed to linger just a little too long. At some point, Jason excused himself and walked toward the edge of the campsite, needing a moment alone. The air was cool now, and the forest was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional hoot of an owl. He stepped off the beaten path, his feet crunching over dried leaves as he wandered deeper into the trees. Then, just as he was about to turn back, he saw it. A small clearing, hidden from view by a wall of thick branches. In the center of the clearing stood a weathered stone monument, half covered in moss. It looked ancient, out of place in the otherwise pristine wilderness. There was an inscription on the side, but it was too faded to make out the words. Jason's curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped closer, brushing the moss aside. His hand froze over the engraving when he saw it, something etched into the stone. It wasn't words, but symbols, strange and jagged, like something ancient, something that didn't belong. He didn't know why, but the moment he touched the stone, a cold chill ran through him. A soft whisper, almost imperceptible, seemed to come from nowhere. "Leave now." Jason spun around, his heart pounding. The whisper was gone, replaced by the thick silence of the woods. For a brief moment, he wondered if he'd imagined it, but something in the air felt heavier now. The darkness was thicker, pressing in from all sides. He rushed back to the campsite, but when he arrived, something was different. Sophie was standing near the fire, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Emma and Dan were silent, their gazes fixed on the ground. "What's going on?" Jason asked, his voice shaking. Sophie didn't speak. She just pointed toward the woods. Jason followed her finger, but all he saw were the trees, their dark silhouettes stretching into the night. But then he noticed something odd. There was movement in the shadows. A figure, barely visible, standing just outside the reach of the firelight. It was tall, almost too tall, with long, spindly arms that hung down unnaturally. Jason's stomach churned, and for a moment, he thought he saw the figure tilt its head toward him, its eyes glinting in the darkness. A pair of glowing, yellow eyes. Then, without warning, the figure disappeared into the woods, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. "Did you see that?" Jason whispered, his voice hoarse. Emma's lips trembled. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could pack up, the air grew colder. The fire flickered and died, plunging them into an oppressive darkness. The crackling sound of the fire was replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. And then the whispers returned. "Leave! Leave now, leave, before it's too late." Jason's heart raced. He turned to his friends. They were all terrified now, their eyes wide with panic. They tried to gather their things, but it felt as if the air itself was holding them in place, trapping them in this nightmare. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble ever so slightly. The trees around them groaned, and something large, something powerful, moved through the woods just beyond their sight. A loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by a scream. Sophie collapsed to the ground, clutching her chest. Dan rushed to her side, but there was nothing they could do. Her eyes were wide open, but she was unresponsive, as if something had stolen her life force right from within her. Panic set in. They tried to run, but the path out seemed to twist and bend, leading them deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around them, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. And then, as they stumbled forward in the pitch blackness, Jason saw it again, the figure. But this time, it wasn't just standing at the edge of the trees. It was closer, much closer. Its tall, gaunt form moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them. The yellow eyes glowed brighter now, and Jason could feel its gaze burning into him. He knew, in that moment, that they weren't just dealing with some lost soul or a harmless ghost. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for them to find it, waiting for them to disturb the campground's dark secret. As the figure lunged forward, Jason barely had time to scream before everything went black. The next morning, the campground was quiet. There were no signs of the group, no trace of their tents, their belongings, or the fire pit. Just the same empty campsite, as though no one had ever been there at all. The old man, who had been sitting by the fire the night before, was gone too, vanished without a trace. But if you listen closely, very closely, you can still hear it. The whisper of the wind through the trees, and the faintest of whispers, warning you to leave before it's too late. It was the perfect summer day, the kind where the sun hung high. The air was warm but not too oppressive, and the water of Lake Whisper shimmered like glass under its golden rays. For Maria, a small lakeside town in the Midwest was the perfect getaway, a quiet retreat from the chaos of city life. She and her husband, Tom, had been planning this trip for months, hoping it would be a chance to reconnect, spend time alone, and enjoy the peaceful simplicity that small towns provided. The lake had a reputation for its calm waters and serene beauty, and the small cabin they rented overlooked the entire stretch of it. They'd arrived the night before, and as the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and purple, Maria felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. It was the kind of tranquility you could only find in places forgotten by time. The town was small, just a few streets lined with old wooden houses and a couple of shops, barely enough to be called a tourist attraction. Lake Whisper was its crown jewel, yet it never seemed to attract large crowds. Those who visited came for its quiet charm, its isolation from the busy world beyond. On their second day at the lake, Maria and Tom decided to take a boat out, just the two of them. They rented a small rowboat, nothing fancy, but it was all they needed. The weather was perfect, and there was something about the stillness of the water that made everything feel so serene, so timeless. The first hour or so was spent in silence, just paddling along the water's edge. Tom occasionally pointed out different birds or wildlife, but mostly they were content to drift, taking in the landscape. The farther they went, the quieter it became. Maria noticed it first. The water, which had once been perfectly still, began to take on an unnatural calm. No ripples, no movement at all. It was almost like the lake was holding its breath. It was then that Maria spotted something unusual, a figure standing at the far side of the lake, just beyond a small cove. It was difficult to make out the details, but the shape of a person was visible, standing motionless at the water's edge. Maria squinted, but by the time she turned to ask Tom if he saw it too, the figure had disappeared, swallowed by the trees and shadows of the cove. "Did you see that?" Maria asked, her voice uneasy. Tom looked in the direction she pointed, but all he saw was the calm, empty shoreline. "See what?" he asked, puzzled. Maria hesitated. She wasn't one to get spooked easily, but something about that figure, it felt wrong. It wasn't a person in a boat, and there weren't any other boats around. Just a lone figure standing there in the middle of nowhere. She chalked it up to her imagination. Maybe it was just a shadow playing tricks on her, or some other odd optical illusion caused by the angle of the light. They continued paddling, but the unease lingered. A few more minutes passed, and they were nearing the cove where Maria had seen the figure. The water seemed colder now, and the air had grown still, too still. Tom stopped paddling, looking around nervously. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Maria strained to listen. There was something like a soft whispering carried faintly by the wind. She couldn't make out any words, but it sounded almost like voices. Tom pulled the boat closer to the shore, moving toward the mouth of the cove. He was determined to get a better look at whatever Maria had seen. As they drew near, the whispers grew louder, though it wasn't clear if they were coming from the water or the trees. The hairs on the back of Maria's neck stood up. "Maybe we should head back," Maria suggested, her voice tight with discomfort. Tom shook his head. "Just a little further. We're already here." As they rounded the bend into the cove, the boat jerked suddenly. Maria gasped, almost losing her balance. Tom cursed under his breath and grabbed the oars to steady the boat. It had struck something beneath the surface. A log, maybe, or some other debris. But when he leaned over to inspect it, his eyes widened in horror. Something was drifting beneath the water. Something pale, translucent, and disturbingly human. It was a body, or what looked like one. Maria's heart skipped a beat. The body was floating just under the surface, moving slowly as if it were alive, but its limbs were stiff, its face frozen in an expression of terror. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the body. "What the hell is that?" Before Maria could answer, the boat was suddenly jerked again, this time violently. The water around them churned, and they were both thrown off balance. Tom grabbed the edge of the boat, his knuckles white. The body below them began to rise, slowly and steadily, as if pulled by an invisible force. Maria screamed as a hand reached up from the depths, fingers long and gnarled, with nails that were far too sharp. The water around them began to swirl, and an eerie, otherworldly voice echoed in the distance. It was as though the lake itself was alive, calling out to them, warning them to leave. The boat rocked violently as the hand reached for them, its fingers brushing against the hull. The lake's surface broke with a loud crack, and in the blink of an eye, The body vanished beneath the water, leaving only ripples in its wake. "Go! Go!" Maria screamed, her voice panicked. Tom began rowing furiously, but it was too late. The lake had claimed them. With each stroke, the boat seemed to drift farther from the shore, as though some unseen force was pulling them deeper into the cove. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding them from every direction. "Tom!" Maria screamed, her voice cracking. "We need to get out of here." But the boat wouldn't move. It was stuck, caught in some unseen current that dragged them deeper into the cove. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The lake calmed once again, eerily still. The whispers faded. The temperature dropped. The boat, now eerily still, sat motionless in the center of the cove. There was no sign of the body, no signs of the strange figures. It was as if everything had vanished, leaving only the stillness of the water behind. But when they made it back to the shore, drenched and trembling, they found that the entire town was gone. The houses, the shops, the streets, they were all empty. There was no one left, not a single soul. The only sign that anyone had ever lived there was the faded sign at the edge of the lake that read, "Lake Whisper, closed for maintenance." Tom and Maria never spoke of that day again. The only thing they ever found to explain it was an old photograph of the town, dated back to the 1940s, showing a different family by the lake. Except in the background, there was a strange pale figure standing at the water's edge, just like the one Maria had seen all those years ago. And it was then that Maria understood. Some things don't belong to this world. They belong to the lake, to the whispers. And once you hear them, you're never truly free. On the edge of a secluded stretch of coastline, where the waves crashed violently against jagged rocks, stood an old lighthouse. It was a relic of a bygone era, long abandoned and untouched by the modern world. Its once proud light had long since dimmed, its lens covered in layers of dust and rust, waiting for a history it had been forced to forget. But it still stood there, silent, brooding, and watching over the blackened waters below. That is, until one summer evening when a couple, Darren and Clara, decided to explore the lighthouse, curious about its storied past. They had heard the local legends, stories whispered in hushed tones at the nearby Inn about the lighthouse keeper who had vanished mysteriously decades ago. But that was just a story, wasn't it? They arrived in the late afternoon, the golden sunlight struggling to break through the thick clouds rolling in from the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and decay. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching long across the cracked pavement leading to the cliff's edge. They could feel the change in the air as they walked toward it, an unnatural stillness, a silence that didn't feel right. "Maybe we should turn back," Clara said, looking around uneasily. Her instincts told her there was something wrong with the place. The wind, usually a constant companion on the coast, was still. Darren laughed it off. "Come on, it's just an old lighthouse. What's the worst that could happen?" He wasn't afraid of ghosts or tales of the supernatural. He believed in logic, in the physical world, the one with facts and explanations. Clara wasn't so sure, but she followed him anyway. The door of the lighthouse creaked open as they pushed it. The air inside was colder than they expected. Dust clung to every surface, and the stale, musty scent of abandonment filled their noses. But what caught Clara's eye was the old lighthouse keeper's desk. It was still there, untouched by time, its chair turned slightly, as if someone had just left it moments ago. Papers lay scattered, yellowed with age, and a lantern, long unlit, sat on the desk. "This place is like a time capsule," Darren remarked, walking past Clara and toward the narrow staircase that spiraled upward into the darkness. Clara hesitated, her mind racing with stories she'd heard over the years. Stories of the keeper, of the storm that had taken his life, and of the strange happenings that followed his disappearance. But she pushed the thought away, her curiosity getting the better of her. They climbed the staircase together, the wind outside howling louder now, rattling the windows. The higher they went, the colder it became, until they reached the top. And that's when the strange things started happening. The light at the top of the lighthouse, once the beacon for lost sailors, was now dark, but it seemed as though something flickered in the distance, just out of sight. A faint, glowing light, too faint to be real. Darren stepped forward, reaching for the lantern on the shelf, but as his hand brushed it, the room was plunged into an unnatural, suffocating darkness. Clara gasped. "Darren." He didn't answer. A moment later, the light flickered back to life, but it wasn't the same. It was dim, eerie, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. That's when Clara saw it. In the corner of the room stood a figure, a man dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a coat heavy with saltwater stains, and an expression that seemed both weary and mournful. He wasn't looking at them. Instead, he was staring out of the window, gazing at the distant ocean, his hand resting on the railing. Who are you?" Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath. The man didn't answer. He didn't move. But something shifted in the air. The temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to groan as if the entire lighthouse was exhaling after being closed for years. Darren turned to her. "Clara, what's wrong with you?" "There's no one there." But Clara's eyes were fixed on the figure. There was no mistaking it. He was there, standing in front of the window, his back to them. She could see the fading light flicker off his face, revealing an expression that made her blood run cold. Sadness, anger, and something else, something darker. The storm outside began to intensify. The wind screamed louder, rattling the old lighthouse like a rickety boat caught in a tempest. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs below was deafening now, as though the ocean was trying to reclaim what was lost. "Clara, let's go. This place is messing with your head," Darren said, grabbing her arm. But Clara wasn't listening. She was too fixated on the figure, now turning slowly toward her. His eyes, empty, hollow, met hers, and for a moment, everything went still. Then he opened his mouth, and a voice, gravelly, ancient, ripped through the silence. "Leave, or be consumed by the storm." Clara froze, terror gripping her heart. She tried to speak, but no words came. The air was thick with dread, suffocating her. Darren tugged at her, pulling her away from the window. "This isn't real, Clara. It's just some trick of the light, or..." Before he could finish, a violent gust of wind slammed into the room, knocking both of them off their feet. The walls groaned louder now, and the lighthouse shook as if it was alive, as if something was trying to break free. Clara scrambled to her feet, looking back to where the figure had stood, but he was gone, vanished into the air like smoke. Yet the wind continued to howl, louder than before, as if calling to them. Darren's face was pale. "We need to get out of here. Now." They rushed down the staircase, but as they reached the bottom, the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, frozen in place, as if something beyond it was holding it shut. The lighthouse groaned again, and the storm outside reached a fever pitch. The windows rattled as waves crashed violently against the cliffs. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, the figure returned. "You should not have come." Suddenly, Clara realized what had happened. The storm wasn't just a storm. It was the storm from a past, the one that had taken the lighthouse keeper's life. And it had never stopped haunting this place. With one final, desperate push, the door gave way, and the couple stumbled outside. The storm raged around them, but the lighthouse was silent. The figure was gone. But as they ran toward the car, Clara looked back once more. The lighthouse stood there, silent, brooding, waiting for the next visitors to fall into its grasp. And for a moment, she could have sworn she saw the faint glow of a lantern at the top, flickering in the dark storm, as though someone was still watching from the top, waiting for the storm to return. It was the perfect summer day. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow over the small lakeside town of Briarwood. For the Reynolds family, it was a long-awaited vacation, a chance to escape the city's noise and take in the peace that only a remote lake could offer. The lake itself, called Blackwater, was known for its stillness, its glassy surface that shimmered in the sunlight. Some of the locals referred to it as the Cursed Lake, but to the Reynolds family, it was nothing more than an inviting spot for fishing and relaxation. The house they rented for the week sat just a few yards from the water's edge. From their porch, they could hear the occasional ripple as a fish jumped, or the rustling of trees when the wind picked up. Everything was calm, serene, until the sun began to dip behind the distant hills. The first evening was idyllic. The family, Mom, Dad, and their 2 teenage children, had unpacked and were making dinner on the porch when a quiet silence settled over the lake. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. It was as if the usual chorus of crickets, frogs, and evening birds had disappeared altogether. "Do you hear that?" Emily, the youngest daughter, asked. Her voice trembled slightly as she looked over at her brother, Mark. "I don't hear anything," Mark replied, his eyes squinting toward the water. He had noticed it too, but he didn't want to seem paranoid. He turned his gaze back to the lake. The once still water was now completely motionless, like a mirror reflecting the darkening sky above. Not a single ripple, not a single movement. Their parents had already gone inside to prepare for the night, dismissing the eerie silence as nothing more than a trick of their imagination. But something in the air felt off. There was an oppressive weight hanging over the lake, something dark, something ancient. As the hours passed, the family tried to brush off the unsettling feeling, but when night fully set in, the air grew cold. The sound of their laughter had faded, and a heavy, quiet hung in the air once more. Emily, restless, pulled on her jacket and suggested they go for a walk along the shore. "Let's just take a look around," she said, eager to break the silence. Her parents reluctantly agreed, and the family stepped outside, walking toward the lake. The path was barely visible in the dark, the trees bordering the water casting long, ominous shadows across their way. They walked in silence, each step echoing in the thick night air. As they neared the water's edge, Emily's curiosity got the best of her. Without thinking, she stepped onto a small dock that jutted out over the water. The old wood creaked under her weight, a stark contrast to the stillness of the lake. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed something unusual, something moving just beneath the surface. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, the dark water reflecting the glint of the stars. But then the shapes became clearer, moving steadily under the surface, just out of reach. They were like figures, human-shaped, shifting slowly through the water, but there was no explanation. They didn't belong there. They were wrong. "Mom! Dad!" Emily called out in a voice laced with fear. Her parents rushed over to her side, following her gaze toward the lake. Mark stepped closer to the dock, peering down into the water. At first, he saw nothing, but then the water shifted again, and there they were, shadows moving in the depths, not just one or two, but a dozen or more, each shape contorting unnaturally, stretching and bending in ways that no human figure should. "What are they?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. "What's down there?" The air around them grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that their breath became visible. They heard the faintest sound, a soft, slithering noise that seemed to come from deep within the lake. The family stood frozen, their hearts racing as the figures began to circle, moving slowly beneath the surface as if they were aware of their presence. Suddenly, one of the shapes broke free from the others, emerging closer to the surface. The water parted, revealing the dark, twisted form of what could only be described as a human figure, its features distorted and malformed, its eyes black voids staring up at them. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the water around it seemed to ripple in strange, unnatural waves. The family scrambled back, their feet slipping on the wet rocks. Emily felt a cold hand brush against her ankle, and she screamed, pulling herself away from the edge. "Get back to the house," her father shouted, grabbing his wife's hand. He turned to the children, his face pale with fear. "Now!" They ran, adrenaline pushing them forward, the shadows on the water shifting in their periphery. As they neared the safety of the house, Emily dared to look back. The lake was still again, its surface now smooth as glass. The shadows were gone, the figures submerged once more. But they were not forgotten. Something was down there, something that had been waiting for them. The family locked the door behind them, but the feeling of unease didn't fade. Through the thin walls of the house, they could hear something strange, a low, distant sound, like whispers carried on the wind. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. For the rest of the night, no one slept. They all lay in their beds, staring into the darkness, listening for any sign that the lake's horrors had come for them. The sound of the whispers grew louder as the hours passed, until it was unmistakable, a soft, mocking laugh, like the one from a child, echoing just outside their window. By morning, the whispers had faded, but the lake remained still. The family packed up and left the house that day, their vacation cut short by the terror they had experienced. As they drove away, they glanced at Blackwater one last time. It looked serene, calm even, the kind of place you might want to return to. But they knew better now. There was something beneath that peaceful surface, something ancient, something that thrived in the quiet and waited for the moment when the calm would break. The Reynolds family would never speak of that night again, but they would never forget the lake's silent horrors, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, when a sudden change in the air caught the attention of the few campers at the lakefront. The day had been perfect, not a cloud in the sky, warm breezes, the occasional laugh of a distant camper. But now, as if in an instant, the atmosphere shifted. It was a feeling, a pressure in the air so thick you could taste it, like the calm before a great, powerful event. As the sky darkened, the first crack of thunder rolled across the horizon, though the storm clouds were nowhere to be seen. At first, the campers brushed it off as just a typical summer storm, one that would blow over quickly, as they usually did. But this one felt different. The air grew colder, biting at their skin. The wind, once a soft whisper, turned harsh and unruly. Branches in the trees twisted and moaned, groaning as though the forest itself was alive, struggling against something far more ancient than the usual summer weather. By the time the campers gathered around the fire pit, trying to stay warm, the sky had turned an ominous shade of gray. The wind howled, sending the flames flickering wildly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance unnaturally in the night. And then, the rain began to fall, but not in the way they expected. It wasn't a gentle summer drizzle. No, the rain came down in thick, almost unnatural sheets. Each drop hit the ground with an audible thud, as though the storm wasn't made of water at all, but of something far heavier. It pounded against the earth with a relentless force, as if it were trying to break through the ground itself. The campers huddled together, trying to shield themselves from the rain, but it wasn't long before they realized something was wrong. As the water splashed against the dirt, the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, as though it were moving alive. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, tried to reach for her backpack, but as she stepped forward, her foot sank into the ground, not just into mud, but into something deeper, something that felt as if it were pulling her down. "Help!" she screamed, but the others couldn't move. The ground seemed to trap them, to hold them in place as the storm intensified. It wasn't just the rain that was coming down anymore. It was as if the very earth was alive, seeking them out. Sarah managed to pull her foot free, but it was covered in something black, like thick oil, but it shimmered unnaturally in the pale light. She recoiled, wiping her foot on the ground in a panic. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't just the storm. Then the ground began to crack. Large fissures formed, splitting open beneath them, and from within those cracks, something started to emerge, something large, ancient. The storm didn't just bring water, it brought something else. A low, guttural sound reverberated from the cracks, like the growl of something massive, waking from a long slumber. The campers watched in horror as something began to rise from the earth. It wasn't a creature, exactly, not in the way they understood. It was more like the earth itself had come alive. Tendrils of thick, black roots, twisted and warped, reached toward the sky, snaking out from the fissures in the ground like the fingers of an ancient giant. Then came the whispers. They weren't loud, but they were clear, as if the earth itself was speaking directly into their minds. The words were indecipherable, lost in the roaring wind and crashing rain. But the meaning was clear. This wasn't storm. This wasn't just bad weather. This was something far more ancient and deadly. One of the campers, Ben, tried to run, but the ground seemed to reach out and pull him back, dragging him toward one of the growing cracks. The others screamed, but their cries were swallowed by the howling storm. The rain had turned black now, like ink pooling around their feet, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the earth was trying to warn them. But it was too late. Ben was gone. The others turned to Sarah, their eyes wide with panic. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking, but even as she spoke, they could feel it. Something was stopping them. Something was holding them in place, as though the earth was claiming them one by one. Suddenly, from behind them, a low, deep groan shook the ground. The campers turned to see the largest of the cracks widening, splitting apart like the mouth of a great beast. From within, a dark shape emerged. A figure, large and imposing, made entirely of twisted roots and shadow. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if it had been waiting for centuries for something or someone to disturb the natural balance. It had no eyes, no face, but its presence was unmistakable. It was the storm. It was the storm and everything that had come with it. The figure stepped forward, and with each step, the wind howled louder. The storm raged in an unholy symphony, the rain coming down in torrents, heavier than before. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, as if the very earth were coming to life. Sarah took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to run," she whispered, but as she turned to flee, the figure raised its hand, or what might have been a hand, and the ground before them cracked open once more. The storm, the earth, the whispers, they were all connected. This wasn't a random act of nature. This storm had been waiting for the right moment to return, and now it had found its victims. The figure advanced, the ground trembling beneath its weight, the storm intensifying with every step. The campers had no choice but to retreat, their feet sinking deeper into the earth, the weight of the storm pressing down on them, holding them in place. They were being consumed piece by piece. Sarah's final thoughts were a blur. The ground reached out, pulling her down into the darkness, her screams swallowed by the wind and the rain. The last thing she saw before she disappeared was the twisted figure standing above her, its mouth opening in a silent, eternal scream. The storm lasted for hours. When it finally passed, there was no trace of the campers. The campsite, once full of life and laughter, was silent. The only sign that something had happened was the unnatural stillness of the air. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, and the lake, once calm and serene, now churned with dark, swirling waters. And in the distance, the storm clouds gathered again, darkening the sky. Waiting, always waiting. It started like any other summer vacation. Blue skies, the scent of pine trees, and the excitement of a weekend getaway. The Anderson family, Mark, his wife Susan, and their two children, Emma and Ben, had rented a small cabin deep in the woods. The kind of cabin you'd see in travel brochures. The perfect escape from the noise of everyday life. It was meant to be a retreat, a break from work, a place to reconnect with each other and nature. The cabin was isolated, tucked away miles from the nearest town. Mark had chosen it for its remoteness. He wanted to disconnect, to experience nature in its purest form. There were no phones, no internet, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the chirping of birds. But from the moment they arrived, there was something off about the place. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The cabin was older than they had expected, the wood worn down by years of weathering. The porch creaked as they stepped inside, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. There was something about the silence that felt too heavy, too unnatural. After unpacking, the family spent the first day exploring the surrounding woods, taking in the beauty of the forest. But even as they walked deeper into the trees, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Emma, who was always the brave one, kept looking over her shoulder, her steps growing quicker as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Mark assured her it was just the usual feeling you get when you're in unfamiliar territory, but deep down, he was starting to feel it too. Something was wrong. As night fell, they gathered around the small fire pit outside the cabin, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The fire crackled, its warm glow casting long, dancing shadows across the clearing. But there was something about the darkness just beyond the firelight. It felt deeper, colder. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like fingers, reaching for something or someone. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, the sounds of the forest seemed to change. The usual nocturnal noises, the hoots of owls, the rustle of small animals, fell silent. In their place was an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional sound of something moving just beyond the trees. Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every now and then, he thought he heard a faint tapping against the window. He chalked it up to the wind, but the tapping didn't stop. It came in a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost as if someone was standing outside, waiting. The next morning, Mark decided to go for a walk alone. He needed to clear his mind. Susan and the kids stayed behind, enjoying the quiet morning, while he ventured into the woods. He walked for what felt like hours, the trees closing in around him. The further he went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped singing, and the air felt thick and heavy. Then he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A figure, pale, thin, and almost translucent. stood at the edge of a clearing, just barely visible between the trees. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was a woman, but her features were too blurred, too faint to make out clearly. She stood motionless, her back to him, staring into the woods as if waiting for something. Mark called out to her, but she didn't respond. He stepped closer, but as he did, she seemed to fade into the trees, her form disappearing like smoke in the wind. Panic surged through Mark's chest. He turned and ran back to the cabin, his mind racing with questions. Who was that woman? Was it a trick of the light? Or something more sinister? When he returned, Susan and the kids were waiting for him, sitting on the porch. They hadn't noticed anything strange, but when he told them about the figure in the woods, Susan's face paled. She mentioned that she'd had strange dreams the previous night. Dreams of someone watching them from the edge of the woods, eyes glowing in the darkness. She hadn't wanted to say anything, afraid of scaring the kids. That night, the tapping returned. But this time, it wasn't just at the window. It was coming from all sides of the cabin, scratching, tapping like fingers brushing against the walls. Mark tried to brush it off, but Susan was now terrified. She insisted they leave, but Mark, stubborn as ever, refused. The vacation had only just begun, and he didn't want to let his fear control him. The next day, things only got worse. Ben, the youngest, had gone out to play near the woods when he disappeared. Susan went into a panic, calling out for him, but he didn't respond. Mark and Susan rushed to the edge of the forest, frantically searching, but the woods were eerily silent. They called out his name again and again, their voices growing desperate, but there was no answer. Finally, after what felt like hours, they found him standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the trees. His eyes were wide, his body frozen. He didn't move when they called to him, and when they finally managed to get him back to the cabin, he couldn't speak. He just kept repeating one thing over and over. She told me to stay. The family was shaken to their core. What had happened out there? Who was the woman in the woods? And why had Ben been drawn to her? That night, they tried to sleep, but none of them could. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. Susan was on the verge of a breakdown, begging Mark to leave, but he still refused. He couldn't explain why, but he felt an overwhelming pull to stay. The next morning, they packed their things, determined to leave. But when they tried to start the car, it wouldn't start. It was as if the engine had died completely. Susan tried to make a call, but there was no signal. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. They were trapped. As the day stretched on, the tapping returned once more. This time, it wasn't just on the cabin. It was in the woods, echoing from all around them. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, they heard a voice they recognized. It was Ben's. He was calling out to them, but his voice was faint, distorted. "Help me," he whispered over and over, until the sound turned into a screeching cry for help. Mark and Susan rushed to the door, but when they opened it, no one was there. The woods were silent once more. With no other choice, Mark decided to venture back into the forest, determined to find their son. But as he walked deeper into the woods, the world seemed to warp around him. The trees closed in, blocking his path. He could hear whispers now, soft, incoherent voices, calling to him from every direction. Then, just as he thought he'd lost his way completely, he saw her again. The pale woman standing in the clearing, her back to him. This time, she turned and Mark saw her face. It was the face of someone he knew. Susan. She stood motionless, her eyes hollow, her lips moving silently as she beckoned him closer. But as Mark stepped forward, the forest around him seemed to twist, to darken. He couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, rooted to the earth. And then, in the distance, he heard Ben's voice once more, calling to him from the depths of the forest. Help me, Daddy, please. But Mark never reached him. The Anderson family was never seen again. Their cabin stood abandoned, the woods around it growing wild. No one knows what happened that summer, but the locals say the woods still whisper at night. And if you listen closely, you might just hear the tapping at your window. The summer heat was oppressive, hanging thick in the air like a heavy blanket. The kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes you long for relief that never comes. A group of friends had been planning this camping trip for months. They were eager to get away from the hustle of the city, to spend a few days in nature, but little did they know that this camping trip would become something far darker than they could have imagined. They arrived at the campground in the early afternoon, just as the sun hung low in the sky. The place had a quiet, almost eerie feel to it. The trees were dense, blocking out the majority of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the camp. But the site itself seemed well kept. There were a few small wooden cabins scattered around, a fire pit in the center, and a small stream that ran along the perimeter. Everything appeared normal, but something about the air felt off. It was too still, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. As they began setting up their tents, one of the friends, Laura, noticed something strange. A wooden sign nailed to a tree just outside the campgrounds. The sign was old, weathered, and covered in layers of peeling paint, but the words were still legible. Welcome to Crescent Pines Camp. The name didn't ring a bell. She had researched dozens of campsites in the area, but this one hadn't shown up anywhere. Hey, has anyone heard of Crescent Pines before? She asked, holding up the sign for the others to see. Nope, replied Mark, the group's unofficial leader. But it looks like an old, out-of-the-way place. We probably just missed it on the map. They shrugged it off, assuming it was just an outdated sign from a bygone era, and continued their preparations. They gathered around the fire pit as dusk began to settle, the sounds of crickets filling the air. But as the night deepened, something else crept into the silence, a strange whispering. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft murmur, almost like the wind rustling through the trees. But as the evening wore on, it grew louder, more distinct. The whispers were coming from the direction of the stream, just past the tree line. At first, they assumed it was just the wind, but as the minutes passed, the whispers became clearer. And it wasn't just one voice, it was many. Soft voices, all speaking at once, unintelligible and yet somehow urgent. Did you hear that? Laura asked, her voice trembling. Everyone went quiet, straining their ears to listen. The whispers had stopped, but the air had changed. The temperature dropped sharply, and a chill ran down their spines. It was still summer, yet it felt like a cold, damp autumn night. Mark was the first to break the silence. It's just animals. Probably raccoons or something, he said, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. I'll go check it out. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the stream, the beam of light flickering as it cut through the darkness. His footsteps were loud against the gravel path, but the further he walked, the quieter the night became. Even the crickets seemed to stop chirping. The rest of the group sat in uneasy silence, watching Mark disappear into the trees. It was only a few minutes before they heard a loud crash, something falling to the ground, followed by a muffled shout. "Mark!" Laura screamed, leaping to her feet. "Mark, are you okay?" But there was no answer. The night swallowed the sound of her voice, leaving only the eerie silence. They waited, hearts pounding, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Mark emerged from the trees, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Mark, what happened?" Laura asked, rushing toward him. He shook his head, breathing heavily. I don't know. I was walking down the path, and then I heard something. It was like footsteps behind me. I turned around, and there was nothing there. But then I saw something else, something moving in the woods. It looked like a person, but wrong. It was like they were glitching, like they weren't fully there. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard the whispers, and now Mark's story seemed to confirm their worst fears. But before they could respond, the whispering returned. It was louder this time, as if the voices were closing in, surrounding them. The wind picked up again, but it didn't feel natural. It felt deliberate. The whispers were sharp, urgent now, as though they were trying to communicate something, but the words were still lost in the chaos of overlapping voices. Laura felt a sudden pressure on her chest, as if the air had thickened around her. She gasped for breath, but it only made the suffocating feeling worse. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely audible. But it was too late. From the direction of the stream came a figure, a shape standing at the edge of the water. At first, it looked like a person, but the closer they looked, the more it seemed wrong. The figure was distorted, like a broken reflection in a mirror. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, its face a blur of features that couldn't be comprehended. The air around it shimmered, like heat rising off pavement. The group froze in terror, unable to look away. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the trees. Panic set in. They grabbed their gear and tried to make their way to the cars, but the campground seemed to stretch farther than it had before. The path that had seemed so short now felt like a maze. No matter how much they walked, the trees only seemed to grow denser, the whispers growing louder with every step. And then, just when they thought they couldn't go any further, they saw it, another sign, this one hanging from a tree with a simple, chilling message: "You can never leave Crescent Pines." The sign seemed to appear out of nowhere, and as soon as they saw it, the whispers stopped. For the first time that night, there was absolute silence. But it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. They were trapped, and they knew it. Mark tried to lead them in the opposite direction, but no matter where they went, the woods seemed to push them back. The trees bent inward, blocking their way. It felt as if the very forest itself was alive, suffocating them, pushing them toward the center of the camp. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, they realized something else. The campground didn't exist on any map. It was as if they had stumbled upon a place that wasn't meant to be found, a place that shouldn't exist. And the worst part, they weren't alone. Something had been watching them from the moment they set foot in Crescent Pines. Something that had always been there, waiting for new souls to wander into its grasp. It was the perfect summer afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the deserted beach. The soft sound of waves breaking against the shore created a peaceful rhythm, and the faint scent of salt and sand lingered in the air. For Julia, it was a much-needed escape. She had just finished a grueling semester of college and decided to unwind at her family's beach house for the weekend. Alone, no distractions, just her and the sea. She strolled along the edge of the water, feeling the cool touch of the ocean breeze. The beach was empty, save for a few scattered seashells and the distant sound of seagulls. It was exactly what she needed to clear her head. But as she walked farther along the shore, she noticed something odd. A man standing by the water, facing the horizon. At first, she thought little of it. After all, the beach was quiet, and people often came to relax or meditate. But there was something strange about him. His posture was unnervingly still, as if he was frozen in time, completely unaware of the world around him. The way he stood, motionless, reminded her of a statue, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Julia stopped walking and watched him for a moment. She couldn't make out his features from the distance, but his silhouette appeared strikingly tall, his limbs thin and angular. The most unsettling part, though, was the way he was staring. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, but his eyes were vacant, distant, as if he wasn't seeing anything at all. Curiosity gnawed at her. She had come here for peace, but now she felt a strange pull, a tension in the air. It was as though the man's presence had disrupted the natural flow of the beach, like a dark shadow that didn't belong. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe he was just another beachgoer caught up in his own thoughts. But she couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. Against her better judgment, she approached him. The sand beneath her feet was soft, but it felt heavier with every step, like the weight of the world was sinking into her bones. As she drew closer, the man didn't move. He remained perfectly still, like an apparition. "Excuse me," Julia called out, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" No response. She took another step forward. "Hello." Her voice was louder now, cutting through the silence. Still nothing. The man didn't even twitch. Julia felt a cold wave of unease wash over her. She had no reason to be scared. After all, it was just a man standing on the beach, right? But something deep within her told her to turn back. She wasn't alone here, not anymore. Just as she was about to retreat, the man turned his head, but not to face her directly. His movements were jerky, as though his neck was creaking with each inch he turned. His eyes were hollow, too dark, too deep, empty voids that seemed to swallow everything around them. There was no recognition in them, no humanity, just darkness. Julia froze. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but her feet were rooted to the sand. She couldn't look away from his eyes, even though her heart raced and her breath grew shallow. The air felt heavier now, charged with an energy she couldn't understand. She felt like she was sinking, as though the earth was pulling her in. Then he spoke, his voice low and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. "Do you see it?" His words sent a chill up her spine. What did he mean? She glanced around the beach, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The waves rolled in lazily, the sky was clear, and the sand stretched endlessly in both directions. But then she noticed something. There was a faint shimmer in the distance, just beyond the water, a line of movement that didn't seem to belong. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He tilted his head, a sickly smile creeping across his face, his lips stretching unnaturally wide. "It's coming for you." Julia's blood ran cold. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in her throat. The feeling of dread that had been creeping up on her now consumed her completely. Her hands trembled, and the air felt thick, as if it were suffocating her. The man's gaze never wavered from her as he took a single, slow step toward her, his feet leaving no imprint in the sand. She took a step back, but before she could react, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. It was subtle at first, like the sand was moving on its own, but then the shift grew more pronounced. The earth beneath her was pulling away, like the beach itself was being swallowed by something far deeper, far darker. Julia's heart pounded in her chest. She had to leave. Now, she turned and ran, but the beach seemed to stretch farther than it ever had. No matter how many steps she took, the water seemed just out of reach. Behind her, she could still hear the man's voice, growing louder with every passing second. "You can't run from it. It's already here." Julia's breath was ragged as she sprinted toward the house, the sand pulling at her legs, as though the beach itself was fighting her. She glanced over her shoulder one last time and saw the man standing at the water's edge, his hollow eyes fixed on her. Then she heard it, the sound of something moving beneath the water, rising from the depths, a dark shape breaking the surface, too fast to comprehend. But before she could make sense of it, the ground beneath her gave way. She fell, tumbling into the darkness, the beach vanishing from her sight. When she awoke, she was back at the beach house, lying in the sand as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night had come without her even realizing it. Her clothes were damp, her skin clammy with cold sweat. But there was no sign of the man, no sign of the shimmer in the water, no sound of the thing rising from the depths. It was as if it had all been a dream, a vivid, horrifying dream. Except for one thing, the footprints. The man's footprints, left in the sand, leading toward the water's edge. It was a hot summer evening when Sarah and her friends decided to take a road trip to a small town up north. They had heard rumors of a forgotten hotel, an old place that had been abandoned for years. It was said to have once been a luxurious retreat for the wealthy, but after a tragic fire years ago, it had been left to decay. They were looking for adventure, something off the beaten path, and the abandoned hotel seemed like the perfect spot for a night to remember. The drive was long, and as the sun began to set, the sky painted itself in shades of red and orange. It was then that they saw it, a long, winding road that led deep into the woods. Overgrown trees lined both sides, and the road itself seemed almost forgotten, barely wide enough for their car to fit. They had heard nothing about this road, but curiosity pushed them forward. After about 20 minutes of driving, they came upon it, the hotel. From a distance, it looked like something straight out of a nightmare. The building was large, its once grand facade now weathered and crumbling, with pieces of brick and wood missing from the structure. Windows were broken, and vines twisted around the iron railing of the balcony. It was as if the hotel had been swallowed by time itself. "There it is," Sarah said, her voice tinged with excitement. The abandoned hotel. Her friends exchanged hesitant glances, but the thrill of doing something forbidden pushed them to leave the safety of their car. They parked near the entrance and stepped out, the heat of the summer air mixing with an unsettling stillness. No birds, no breeze, just an eerie silence that enveloped them. "Should we go in?" Mark, the most cautious of the group, asked. "Of course," Sarah said with a grin. "We'll be fine. It's just an old hotel." The doors were ajar, their hinges creaking as they pushed their way inside. The lobby was dark, the air thick with dust. There were remnants of old furniture, tattered chairs, a broken chandelier hanging from a ceiling, and old wallpaper peeling away from the walls. It was the kind of place that would make most people turn around and leave, but not them. They were here for the thrill, for the unknown. They explored the hotel for hours, finding rooms that were in various states of decay. Each room had a different story to tell, with old photographs of guests who no longer seemed to matter. The more they ventured deeper into the hotel, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Sarah was the first to notice something strange. In one of the rooms, she found a worn leather book on the floor, its pages yellowed and brittle. She picked it up and opened it, scanning the faded writing. It seemed to be a guest book filled with names of people who had stayed there over the years. But the final entries were different. They weren't names at all. Instead, they were words, names that seemed to repeat. Luriel, Luriel, Luriel. Sarah shuddered. The name was strange, unfamiliar, yet somehow haunting. She showed the book to her friends, who were equally unsettled by the eerie repetition. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mark asked, his voice now tinged with unease. "I don't know," Sarah replied, "but I don't think it's just a coincidence." As they continued to explore, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The temperature dropped, and they could see their breath in front of them. The walls creaked, and the sound of footsteps echoed throughout the hotel, but when they turned around, no one was there. It felt as if something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. They made their way up to the second floor, where the hall was lined with old, decaying rooms. The feeling of being watched was even stronger here, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following them. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said suddenly, her voice shaky. "This place isn't right." But just as they turned to leave, the door to one of the rooms creaked open by itself. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a hesitant step toward the door. A low whispering sound came from within. She couldn't understand the words, but there was no mistaking the desperation in the voice. It was as if someone or something was trying to communicate with them. "Did you hear that?" she asked, looking at her friends. They nodded, but none of them moved. "Maybe we should check it out," said Mark, his curiosity getting the better of him. With the faintest of steps, Sarah moved toward the door and pushed it open. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. The room was untouched, except for one thing: a large mirror hanging on the wall. It wasn't dusty like the rest of the hotel. In fact, it was pristine, its surface gleaming as if it had just been cleaned. But as Sarah stared into the mirror, she saw something that made her gasp. A figure, standing just behind her, smiling. The reflection of her friends was normal, but the figure in the mirror wasn't. It was a woman, pale, with dark, hollow eyes. She wore a tattered dress that seemed out of place with the time, like something from a century ago. "Sarah, get away from the mirror," Mark said, his voice shaking. But it was too late. The woman in the mirror began to move, her fingers reaching out toward the glass, as though trying to break through. Sarah stepped back, but the reflection of the woman in the mirror did not. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Sarah felt a cold breath on her neck, as if someone were standing right behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her ears, the words clearer now. "Luriel! Luriel! Luriel!" Suddenly, the ground shook, and the hotel seemed to come alive with energy. The doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted and writhed, as if they were alive. Something was awakening, something that had been waiting in this forsaken hotel for years. "Luriel!" The voice echoed through the hotel once more, louder this time. Then, the room fell silent. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her, suffocating her. She reached for her friends, but they were nowhere to be found. Panic set in. She turned to run, but the hallway stretched out in front of her, endless and dark. She tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The only sound now was the faint, distorted whisper of the name, "Luriel." And then, just like that, everything went dark. The hotel remained abandoned, its doors now sealed shut. Locals say that the curse of Luriel still lingers there, waiting for the next unwitting travelers to disturb the forgotten summer curse. And if you listen closely, you might hear her name echoing in the distance. "Luriel! Luriel!" It was the summer of 2007, and the heat was unbearable. The kind of oppressive, suffocating air that made it feel like the world itself was melting under the sun's heavy gaze. For Matt and Sarah, two college friends trying to escape their mundane lives, it seemed like the perfect opportunity for a road trip, a chance to unwind, to explore the unknown, and to take one last carefree vacation before the harsh realities of adulthood crept in. They had no real destination in mind, just an old, faded map and the promise of adventure. They packed their bags, filled the car with gas, and set off on a road that stretched endlessly ahead of them. The highway was desolate, stretching through small towns and vast, barren stretches of farmland. It was the kind of place where nothing seemed to happen. But for Matt and Sarah, the quiet solitude felt like freedom. As they drove further into the heart of the country, the towns grew smaller, the people fewer. Eventually, they came across a small, seemingly forgotten town on the outskirts of nowhere, nestled between a vast forest and a mountain range. The kind of place where the past lingered in the air, and nothing seemed to change from one year to the next. "We should stop here for the night," Sarah suggested, her eyes scanning the quiet streets. "It's been hours, and I could use a rest." Matt, always the more adventurous of the two, shrugged. "Sure, why not? It's a little off the beaten path, but we're here. Let's check it out." The town seemed empty at first, but as they drove deeper into the center, they noticed that the houses weren't abandoned. Lights flickered in windows, and the faint hum of a television could be heard in the distance. It was a place stuck in time, frozen in the nostalgia of simpler days. They pulled into a small motel with a faded neon sign, its flickering light casting a dim glow over the cracked pavement. The motel had an old-world charm, the kind that made it feel like it had been around for decades. The front desk clerk, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a slow, deliberate voice, handed them the key. "Room 12. You folks traveling far?" she asked, her tone odd, like she wasn't used to seeing visitors. "A few states away," Matt answered, trying to keep things casual. "Best stay here for the night," she advised. "Not much past this town. You'll be in the mountains soon enough. Road's dangerous that way. Best rest up." They nodded, both a little unnerved by her strange, almost cryptic warning. But the idea of a good night's sleep outweighed any unease. They thanked her and headed to their room, a cramped, dimly lit space that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. Night fell quickly, and the oppressive heat didn't ease. Matt cracked the window to let in what little breeze there was, and they both tried to settle into the uncomfortable silence. Outside, the sounds of the town seemed to fade, as though it were being swallowed by the dark. Around midnight, Sarah was the first to hear it, a soft knock on the door. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Matt, who seemed equally startled. "Who could that be?" she whispered. Matt got up, hesitating for a moment before making his way to the door. He peered through the peephole. No one. He waited a moment longer, then opened the door just enough to check the hallway. Empty. But as he turned to close it, something caught his eye. Just beyond the door frame, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. The figure was blurry, distant, too far to make out any features. But it was watching them, unmoving, like it had been there for hours. "Matt!" Sarah's voice trembled from behind him. He quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. They both sat in silence for a few moments, trying to convince themselves it was nothing more than an illusion, a trick of the light. But that's when they heard it again, a soft, scraping sound. It was coming from the window. Matt stood and cautiously approached, his feet dragging along the carpet. He opened the window, his heart pounding. No one was there. He closed it quickly, but the scraping noise continued. It was faint, almost like nails running across the glass. "Something's wrong," Sarah said, her voice shaky. They sat in the dim light, trying to process what was happening. Then, suddenly, the air in the room grew cold. Not just chilly, but icy, as though a wind had swept through from an unknown source. Sarah's breath misted in front of her face. She looked at Matt, her eyes wide with fear. The scraping stopped, but in its place a low, distant hum began, vibrating through the walls, the floor, even the bed beneath them. It was a song, a lullaby of sorts, sweet and haunting but distant. It sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. "What the hell is that?" Matt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah reached for her phone, but there was no signal. No service, just the eerie hum and the cold. They could hear voices now, faint murmurs just beyond the door, growing louder by the second. Matt, we need to leave," Sarah whispered urgently. He nodded, rushing to gather their things. But as they reached the door, it wouldn't open. The lock had jammed. They tried again, frantically pulling and pushing, but it refused to budge. The voices outside grew louder, the murmurs turning into whispers, and the whispers into something more, something that felt personal. They could feel the presence on the other side, like eyes staring at them through the wood. Then, suddenly, the door burst open, but there was no one there. Just the dark, empty hallway. The hum continued, louder now, pulling them in, urging them to follow. They had to leave. They had to get out of that motel. They bolted into the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. But the moment they stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The humming was deafening, and they felt it, a weight pressing on them from all sides. They moved, stumbling through the darkness, but every turn they took led them back to the same place. The hallway stretched forever. They ran, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breaths ragged with panic. But when they finally reached the exit, they saw it, the figure from the hallway, standing by the door, waiting for them. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, darker than night, and it watched them with eyes that glowed faintly, burning with a cold, unnatural light. They screamed, but no sound came out. And just like that, everything went silent. The next morning, the motel was empty. The parking lot was silent. There were no traces of Matt or Sarah. Just an old, weathered sign hanging above the front desk, offering rooms for rent to the next unsuspecting traveler. The sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest that surrounded the old, secluded cabin. Sarah and her friends had been planning the trip for months. A quiet weekend getaway, far from the chaos of the city. They had rented the cabin tucked away in the mountains, a place they'd found through an obscure website. It seemed perfect, isolated, peaceful, and a perfect escape from the distractions of everyday life. But as they arrived and unpacked their bags, something felt off. The air was too still, the trees too silent, as if they were holding their breath. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just her nerves. After all, who wouldn't feel a little uneasy in a cabin miles from civilization? The others, Luke, Emma, and Ben, were already inside, unpacking and settling in. The inside of the cabin was charming, rustic even, wooden beams on the ceiling, an old stone fireplace, and a large dining table. But the faint smell of dampness clung to the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they moved around, as though the house was alive, aware of their presence. "Come on, Sarah. You've been quiet," Luke called from the kitchen, his voice breaking the silence. "You're not scared of a little cabin in the woods, are you?" Sarah forced a smile, trying to brush off the unease that had settled in her chest. "Just a little tired," she replied. "I'll be fine." After a quick dinner, they gathered around the fireplace. The crackling fire was comforting, but it wasn't enough to drown out the growing sense of discomfort that was settling over the group. They sat in silence, sipping their drinks, occasionally glancing at the darkened windows, where the shadows outside seemed to stretch and writhe. At first, Sarah thought it was the wind, but as the evening wore on, she began to hear something else. Soft, almost imperceptible tapping on the windows, like fingers lightly brushing the glass. It was so faint she questioned whether she was imagining it, but the sound was unmistakable. The others hadn't noticed it yet, too caught up in their own conversations, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and then they went out completely. "Great, the power's gone," Ben grumbled, standing up to fetch a flashlight from his bag. "I'll check the fuse box," Emma said, moving toward the door that led to the basement. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The silence in the room was now deafening. No one spoke as the darkness swallowed them whole. Only the soft shuffle of footsteps as they moved around the cabin. Sarah felt her anxiety rise. She turned toward the windows, her breath catching in her throat when she saw a shadow move just outside. A figure, tall, lean, its features indistinguishable in the darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching her every move. She froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, voice trembling. "What?" Luke turned to her, eyes wide with confusion. "There was someone outside," Sarah whispered urgently. I saw someone in the woods, right by the window." Luke glanced toward the window. "There's nothing out there, Sarah." But the sinking feeling in Sarah's stomach told her otherwise. Something was out there, and it was watching them. Before she could say another word, Emma screamed from the basement. Her scream echoed through the cabin, sharp and filled with terror. Without thinking, Sarah and Luke rushed toward the basement door, Ben close behind. But when they reached the stairs, they froze. Emma was standing at the bottom of the stairs, pale as a ghost, her hand clutching the wall for support. Her eyes were wide with fear, her breath shallow. "There's something down there," she gasped, her voice shaky. "I saw something move." The air grew cold, colder than it had any right to be in the middle of summer. "What do you mean something moved?" Luke asked, taking a cautious step forward. "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice trembling. "It was like a shadow, a figure, but it wasn't human. It moved too quickly. It was wrong." Ben, trying to stay calm, turned on the flashlight and shone it down into the basement. But the beam of light illuminated nothing but old, dusty boxes and cobwebs. Still, a sense of something lurking just out of sight lingered in the air. "I don't like this," Sarah said quietly, stepping back from the stairs. Her breath hitched as she looked toward the front door, her eyes widening. The door was slightly ajar. Before anyone could react, the wind picked up, howling through the trees outside. The door swung open with a creak, and in the doorway stood a figure. A man, or at least it looked like a man. Tall, disheveled, with dark, matted hair. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were hollow, sunken, his gaze piercing. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But as the wind howled through the trees, Sarah felt the temperature drop even further, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper. Her skin prickled with an intense, unexplainable fear. The figure didn't enter the cabin. He stood there, silent, unmoving, his eyes locked on them. And then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Who was that?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Ben said, his voice thick with fear. "But we need to leave. Now." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that leaving the cabin wasn't the answer. That whatever was outside, it wasn't just a random stranger. It was something older, something that had been waiting for them to arrive. As the group hurried to gather their things, the lights flickered back on, but it was too late. The shadows had already crept into the corners of the room, their shapes twisting unnaturally. They had been marked, and whatever it was that haunted this place had no intention of letting them go. The cabin in the pines wasn't just a house. It was a trap, a place where the past and the present bled together, where ancient horrors waited just out of sight in the dark corners of the world, watching, waiting. And for Sarah and her friends, there would be no escape. It was the summer of 1986 when Grace and her friends decided to spend a weekend at the old, rustic cabin near Hollow Creek, a small village nestled in the woods far from civilization. The cabin, owned by Grace's late grandmother, had been passed down to her, though she rarely visited it. The area was quiet, isolated, and had always been the perfect place to escape the noise of the city. The sun hung low in the sky when they arrived, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The cabin was exactly how Grace remembered it, shrouded in mystery, its wooden walls weathered by time and the harsh elements. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the faint chirp of distant cicadas was the only sound breaking the silence. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As the group settled in, unpacking their bags and preparing for a relaxing weekend, Grace noticed something odd. A small wooden sign by the entrance, one she had never seen before, had been hung over the doorframe. It read, "The Traveler Knows No Time." She thought little of it at first. Maybe her grandmother had placed it there in her later years. But something about it felt off, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. That evening, after they had eaten and were sitting around the fire pit outside, the conversation turned to the strange history of Hollow Creek. The village was known for its peculiar folklore, and many of the locals had spoken in hushed tones about a mysterious traveler who had once arrived in the town many years ago. The story went like this. In the early 1900s, a man, known only as the Traveler, appeared on the outskirts of Hollow Creek. He was described as wearing old-fashioned clothing, with a weathered satchel slung over his shoulder. No one knew where he came from or where he was headed. He never stayed in one place for too long. Some said he was a lost soul. Others believed he had made a pact with something dark. No one had ever seen him leave, and over time, his presence became a part of Hollow Creek's identity. The strange thing was, every time someone tried to follow the Traveler or find out more about him, they'd disappear. It was as if the man had a way of evading the searchers, slipping through the fabric of time itself. Grace shivered as the fire flickered, casting erratic shadows around them. She chuckled nervously, trying to shake off the creeping unease settling in her chest. "Isn't it a little too hot for ghost stories?" she joked, but the others didn't laugh. That night, as Grace lay in bed, the cabin groaned softly under the weight of the silence. She could hear the distant rustle of trees swaying in the breeze. The old house seemed to breathe with her, like it was alive in some strange, subconscious way. She rolled over, glancing at the clock on the nightstand. It was 2:17 a.m. Suddenly, there was a knock on her bedroom door. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Grace sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who is it?" she whispered, though she was sure she was alone. The door creaked open, but no one was there. Her breath hitched, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Was it one of her friends playing a prank? She got out of bed cautiously and stepped into the hall. The house was quiet, too quiet. She walked toward the stairs, her footsteps muffled by the worn wooden floorboards. At the foot of the stairs stood an open door. Grace could have sworn it had been closed when she went to bed, but now it was wide open, revealing the guest room. Without thinking, she stepped closer, her curiosity growing. The air felt colder now, and the flickering of the distant firelight barely reached this far into the cabin. As she approached the doorway, she saw something strange on the floor, a footprint. But it wasn't just any footprint. It was faint, like someone had walked in and out of the room, but the prints were oddly deep, as if the person had walked through something wet. She bent down to inspect the marks, her hand trembling as she reached for the floor. There was nothing wet or damp on the wooden boards, but the prints continued, leading into the dark room. She stepped back, her heart racing. She wanted to call out to her friends, but something in her gut told her not to. She didn't know why. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something deeper, some instinct that was warning her. Suddenly, a soft whisper reached her ears. "Grace!" It was faint, like a memory drifting through her thoughts, yet it sounded so real. She spun around, her breath hitching in her throat. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, but Grace could make out the shape. The man. His clothes were old-fashioned, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. But his eyes were clear, staring straight at her. They were cold, distant, yet full of an ancient, knowing sadness. Grace froze. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. It was like the air around her had thickened, making it impossible to breathe. He stepped forward slowly, his movement fluid like he was gliding. He didn't seem to touch the ground, yet he was coming closer. The closer he got, the more she could feel a cold, unsettling presence radiating from him. He stopped just inches from her, his voice barely a whisper. "You've seen me before. You've always seen me." The words echoed in her mind. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Before Grace could react, the figure was gone. The air went back to normal, and the room seemed to return to its original stillness. But something had changed. A feeling lingered, a sense of unease she couldn't shake. When Grace returned to the living room, her friends were all asleep, sprawled out on the couches and floor. The clock on the wall read 3:10 a.m., and she was certain no time had passed since she'd seen the figure. The house felt different now, though, as if something had shifted, as if the boundaries of time and space had somehow bent just for a moment. The next day, Grace told her friends about what happened, but they laughed it off, thinking it was just a product of the old house and her overactive imagination. But when they checked out the cabin a few days later, Grace noticed something on the wall by the front door. A small wooden sign that hadn't been there before, right next to the one that read, "The Traveler Knows No Time." This one was simple, handwritten in faded ink, "I never left." And with that, Grace knew. The traveler had come to Hollow Creek, and perhaps, in some twisted way, he had never truly left. No one who had stayed in that cabin before had ever returned unchanged, and now, Grace had learned the truth. The traveler would wait, silently, patiently, until someone else arrived, someone who had unknowingly stepped into his world of timeless torment. And this time, Grace would never escape. It was a calm summer evening when Sarah and her friends arrived at the small coastal town of West Hollow, a place famous for its quiet beaches and untouched shoreline. The town seemed like a picture out of a postcard. Gentle waves lapping against the shore, seagulls calling in the distance, and the golden hue of the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything. They'd come for the weekend, seeking a peaceful escape from their busy lives. The group rented a small beach house near the water, a quaint two-story cottage nestled in a secluded part of the bay. The realtor who had shown them the property had warned them about one thing. No one stayed out by the sea after midnight. But he didn't elaborate. Just an odd little remark that Sarah and her friends had brushed off as local superstition. After all, it was summer, and what harm could there be in enjoying the beauty of the beach under the stars? As the sun sank lower, they set up a fire on the beach, their laughter filling the air as they roasted marshmallows and reminisced about old memories. But as nightfall came, a sense of unease began to settle over them. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks seemed to grow louder, and the breeze took on an unfamiliar chill. Around midnight, Sarah noticed something strange. The wind had stopped, the waves had fallen silent, and the air had grown thick, almost suffocating. It was as if the sea itself had held its breath. At first, it was easy to dismiss. It was just the stillness of the night, a rare moment of perfect quiet. But then, Sarah's attention was drawn to the horizon. At the edge of the darkened water, something appeared to be moving. It was too far to make out clearly, but the shape seemed to flicker, vanishing and reappearing as if it were walking along the water's edge. "Hey, do you guys see that?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Her friends looked up, but the shape was gone. The sea was calm again, and nothing seemed out of place. They shrugged it off, attributing it to the odd effects of the moonlight playing tricks on their eyes. But as the night wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was still thick, and the uneasy quiet stretched longer than it should have. She kept hearing faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind, but no one else seemed to hear them. At times, it almost felt like someone was standing just behind her, close enough to make her skin prickle, but when she turned, there was no one there. Minutes later, Sarah caught a glimpse of it again. A faint figure at the edge of the water, moving slowly, methodically. This time, she wasn't imagining it. There was definitely someone or something standing at the shoreline. She blinked, trying to focus, but the figure seemed to fade away, swallowed by the vast darkness of the sea. "This isn't funny," Sarah said, a chill creeping up her spine. "There's something out there." Her friends laughed, brushing it off as a prank. But Sarah knew better. She could feel it, an unseen presence lurking in the depths of the water. Something ancient, something that shouldn't be disturbed. "Let's go inside," she urged, her voice tight with discomfort. Reluctantly, her friends agreed, but none of them seemed as disturbed as Sarah. As they made their way back to the house, the air grew colder still. The faint whispers grew louder, though they were still too faint to make out. Sarah could hear her name being called, the voice soft and distant, like a memory she couldn't place. When they reached the house, the front door creaked open. They stepped inside, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was like something was still following them, pressing closer with each passing second. They locked the door and drew the curtains, trying to settle down for the night, but the oppressive silence outside weighed heavily on them. It was as though the world beyond the windows had disappeared entirely. The moon was now a pale sliver in the sky, barely visible through the thick clouds that had formed. As the hours passed, Sarah's unease only deepened. Her friends had long since fallen asleep, but Sarah stayed awake, her eyes fixed on the window. There was something she couldn't shake, an overwhelming sense of dread, like the house was closing in on her. And then, just as she thought she might be imagining it, she heard a faint tapping sound at the window. Her heart leaped in her chest. She quickly got up and pulled the curtains aside. Nothing. But when she turned back toward the room, she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, just outside the room. The figure was tall, draped in a tattered cloak, and its face was hidden beneath a hood. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, staring into the room, its presence suffocating. Sarah froze, unable to scream or move. It was as if her body refused to acknowledge the horror in front of her. She blinked, and the figure was gone. She rushed to the door, but it was locked. The lock clicked and clicked as she struggled to open it, the sound of the old brass mechanism echoing through the house. Panic gripped her, and she turned back to the window, hoping to see some sign of help. But when she looked outside, there was nothing. Only the dark, endless ocean, and something that wasn't quite human standing at the water's edge, watching. It wasn't until dawn that Sarah managed to fall asleep, exhausted from the terror that had consumed her. The sun's first light broke over the horizon, and the oppressive silence lifted, the sound of the sea returning to normal. Her friends awoke, none the wiser to the horror Sarah had experienced. But as they prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that she wasn't alone. The air still felt thick, and when she turned to take one last look at the beach, she saw the figure standing once more, just beyond the waves, waiting. The town of West Hollow remained silent on that summer morning, as though it had swallowed all the secrets of the night before. And as Sarah and her friends left, the house at the edge of the shore stood undisturbed, waiting for its next visitors.